Hi, welcome to More Christ. This is a channel dedicated to Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox alike. Today I'm joined by Fr Michael Plekon. He's an American priest, professor, an author, and a sociologist and a theologian. He's published more than a dozen books, as well as hundreds of journal papers, book chapters, and reviews on faith and holiness. His works include religious social history, social theory, and his connections with theology. The works of Søren Kierkegaard, contemporary Orthodox theology, and theologians, especially of the Russian emigration and saints. He's especially interested in the encounter with God in the everyday. So just to begin then, Fr Michael, can you tell us a bit about your background and some of the key currents in your life that have helped form your character?
Well, I don't want to spend too much time on that. I have written a chapter in one of my books, if you want to read a little bit more detail. The book is called The World as Sacrament. But essentially, I grew up in Yonkers, which is a suburb. It's just over the line from the Bronx. So I'm really a New Yorker. My family, or both sides of my family, came from the same little village in Western Ukraine and migrated over to the United States before the First World War. And as most people did in those days, they came through Ellis Island. And because they were from what was then called the Austro-Hungarian province of Galicia and didn't call themselves Ukrainians, they were referred to on their passports as Ruthenians, very, old way of referring to them. They first went through Ellis Island and settled on the Lower East Side, which is more fashionably today referred to as the East Village. And so they began to work. Both of my grandfathers had a trade that they came with, and they all got married. The two couples got married at the same church. The old building is gone, but there is a newer one, St. George's, on 7th Street there, right across the street from the oldest continuously operating tavern in New York City, and then just down the street from the very famous Cooper Union, which is one of the oldest schools that has no tuition. It was set up by a philanthropist in the 1800s. Anyway, from my parents, without them knowing it, because none of them were trained theologians. I mean, mostly they graduated from high school. I kind of was exposed to a living ecumenism, and it didn't hurt that as I was a teenager and looking to try to find a way in life, I wanted to be a priest and maybe a monk or a friar, so that I followed up with one of the friar orders, the Carmelites, and I went to their minor seminary, St. Albert's, which is in Orange County, New York. It's kind of now within the exurbs of New York City, but it's a good hour and a half from the city. And in those days, like everywhere, you were encouraged. People thought it was a wonderful thing if you wanted to be a sister or a brother or a priest. So I went there and I had an excellent training because the Carmelite fathers and brothers who staffed it believed in a good, solid secondary education. And I continued on. I went to novitiate. In those days, you went right after high school. That was the level of the seminary. And I went into the novitiate when I was canonically too young to actually be professed. I was only 17, but by the end of the year, I was 18, so I was canonically okay. And I did that, and I've even put pictures of myself and my class in our white mantles. The Carmelites are referred to as the White Friars, and their parish in Dublin is, I think, called that. The Carmelites then sent me to a theology, an undergraduate college that they had in the province of Ontario in Canada, right across the border from Buffalo, New York. And did 2 years there, and then because of the Vatican Council, which very much was the place that I absorbed a sense that the church was wider than just my church, we were sent down to Catholic University, which is a very well-known school in Washington, D.C., and I finished up my undergraduate work there. In those days, you had to, in addition to your major subject, you also had to have at least a minor or a major in theology and then a minor in philosophy. So I had a lot of credits. I could have had a master's degree after I was finished. But I want to go back to my family. I started out in the Byzantine Rite of the Catholic Church because the people in that part of Western Ukraine, they're sometimes referred to as uniates, but that's kind of an epithet. They're Ukrainian Greek Catholics, and there are Byzantine Catholics all over Eastern Europe, even in Russia. So that's where I was baptized and confirmed, chrismated, and that's what I grew up with. But my family lived so far away from the Ukrainian church that we simply started going to the local Roman Catholic Church, which, by the way, at that time was almost completely Irish American, as were the Carmelites that I joined. So I have been the odd guy who wore green on St. Patrick's Day, but when asked what county did your people come from, I said, well, Ternopil, you know, not Kerry or the others.
Yeah.
So I had an exposure, you know, right away, first from the East, where everything was in Slavonic in church, which nobody understood, to Latin, which nobody understood. And so I had a good dose of the pre-Vatican II church, novenas and the rosary and the May processions and the Stations of the Cross and all of that. And once a year they would invite in a priest from a religious order to be there during Lent and scare us out of our wits about hell. The Dominicans were very good at that, by the way. But unwittingly, my family, you know, had an understanding that the church was not constricted to just what they grew up with, but now they were experiencing, in my family, the Latin Rite or Roman Catholic Church. I do remember vividly, which I wrote about, that when our neighbor, who was a beloved man in our block, died, and was being buried from the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church, that my family went, and it was a funeral mass, and we simply went up to communion. And I remember afterwards asking my mother, we were okay to do that? And she said, why not? It's communion. It's Christ. And so, I mean, it was interesting because my grandmother, who was probably in her 80s, was still alive then, and she had no problem with it either, you know. So that was my exposure, and for better, I would say, not worse. It's been with me all of my life. Without telling all the details of my life, I mean, after I did my undergraduate degree, I decided I wasn't sure about continuing as a friar. So I asked if I could have a year to teach like the Jesuits often do with their tertianships. And I did teach secondary school in Pennsylvania in the coal region, not far from where my dad was born. And at the end of that year, I asked to be dispensed from the vows. It was Vietnam, so I decided I would go and speak to the chaplain, one of the chaplains at the university that I was planning to go to do my graduate work at. And he advised me about becoming a conscientious objector, which means you have to appear before a panel. You have to write a whole bunch of essays and defend your claim that due to your faith, you can't serve in active combat, but that you could do some kind of alternative service. And so I did. I was approved, and I did almost 2 years of service as a Head Start teacher. This was at the time a program designed during the Lyndon Johnson years as a way of giving children from a very impoverished background a leg up before they went into public schools or into schools. So I did that, even though I had never taught that level before, but I got some training. And so I did that, which actually meant being a social worker too. So, because I had to relate to the families. And then I started graduate work. I had written to the very well-known, recently deceased sociologist of religion and theologian, Peter Berger, who was teaching at the State University of New Jersey at the time, which is just across the river from New York. And so Peter Berger accepted me. I sent him all of my documents, and I started doing classes. Even while I was still a Head Start teacher, I would do an evening class or something, a weekend class. And then when I finished my service, I started full-time, and I just kept going through all the courses. I did my master's degree. And then finally, when it came time to pick out a topic for my dissertation, I said to Berger, look, I'd really like to put together theology and social theory. And so I'd like to look at Søren Kierkegaard, because most people understand him to be a philosopher of religion. Actually, he was trained as a theologian. His degrees were in theology. He even passed all the exams, including the preaching test, to get ordained as a priest in the Church of Denmark. And so I focused mostly on his later theology, and particularly on his attack on the Church of Denmark, which was not an attack on Christianity, but an attack on what the early 19th century had done to church. It had made it a bourgeois extension of society, where you could come for nice, comforting words, but essentially it wasn't anything to be taken too seriously. And this is, if you will, a malaise that has affected every church that there ever has been. Catholic, Reformation, Orthodox, Pentecostal, you name it. All of them are capable of becoming tools of a government, of a state, or of a culture. And we've seen in recent years so much cultural religion, particularly very conservative cultural religion. So that's sort of where I came from. And almost everything that I've ever written and published is in one way or another, believe it or not, connected back to the idea of wanting to put together what goes on in society and what goes on in the church. And that's one of the reasons why not only did I write my dissertation on Kierkegaard, but I probably published a dozen or more articles on him. And that's why eventually I got into writing about and translating the works of these wonderful emigre Russian writers, theologians, philosophers, who fled the Russian Revolution and ended up eventually in Paris, and who had given to them really by the American Episcopal Church and the American YMCA a seminary, as well as a publishing house. And then even those two benefactors helped finance the wonderful work of an association called Orthodox Action, by which they financed Mother Maria Skoptsova's Houses of Hospitality. These are very similar to what Dorothy Day had in New York City at the same time. But in the case of Mother Maria, during the Nazi occupation, she and her chaplain made out baptismal certificates for Jews and resistance people and others, and tried to protect them in the parish. And eventually they were hunted out by the Gestapo, sent to the concentration camps, and killed there. And now they're saints. That's a lot of information. Maybe I should just stop and let you.
No, that's great. Thank you, Father Michael. So let's just move on to a few of your books, if we may, which tease out some of these things that you've been speaking about. So one is The World as Sacrament, Ecumenical Reflections on Worldly Spirituality. So in that book, you introduce us to several persons of faith, both Eastern and Western, who illumine God's presence in our everyday life and see the world as a sacrament and sacramental. So as a lover of Father Schmemann, I think this is amazing and a necessary corrective to our modern secularism and the way we perceive the world. So what does it mean then ultimately to understand the world as sacrament, and why do you think it's so essential that we do rediscover this?
Well, because Father Schmemann actually published an article called The World as Sacrament. Not sure where he got that line from, but it could have been from any number of sources. I didn't include him in this book. I included him in several others of my, I think, three or at least three others, other books that I did. But what I wanted to do in that book is to argue that the divide that we sometimes make between the profane and the secular, between the religious and the worldly, are not necessarily good ways of distinguishing between the two, for the simple reason that in Christianity, at the very core of it is God becoming human, therefore taking up time and space as Jesus of Nazareth, and then through his preaching and work, talking about a kingdom of God that did not displace the state or the economy or the culture, but that became part of all of them. So there was a kind of a integration or integrity between faith and world, liturgy and life. To do this, what I did is I went back to people I'd already written about, and then at the urging of one of the editors of the Liturgical Press, the Catholic publisher in Collegeville, Minnesota, who published this book, I basically found several writers from the Western Church and several from the Eastern Church. And I didn't try to contrast and compare them as much as I simply listened to each of them in what they wrote. So a couple of examples. So among the Western writers, I knew that he was very popular, and I wondered if they'd object to this, but I decided to propose Thomas Merton, who's very, very well known, the Trappist monk, whose secretary, by the way, over the years I became a good friend of in my trips to visit Gethsemane Monastery. That's a no-brainer. You know, Thomas Merton was easy to write about. I've written lots of essays and published them about Thomas Merton. But in this one, I talked about that wonderful experience he had in 1958, where he was downtown. I think he was there for a doctor or dentist appointment, and then came into the square there, 4th and Walnut, and all of a sudden saw everybody running back and forth to get to lunch, and said, wow, this is what my whole life is about. Not to just be at the monastery, separated from all of this, but to be part of this. All of us to be part of the gospel, living out the gospel for the life of the world. So then I also included Dorothy Day. She was a natural. There had been plenty written about her because she wrote a great deal, just like Merton did. But I also included, you may know her name, she's just publishing one more book in this series, Marilyn Robinson, who for many years taught writing at the University of Iowa, the creative writing program there. She comes from a Reformed Church background. The first of her books that won the Pulitzer Prize, Gilead, was all about a Presbyterian minister essentially writing letters to his son because he's afraid he'll be dead by the time the boy grows up. And he wanted to know about his life and his faith. And that grew into a trilogy. And then now she's written one more book in it. Every one of those books is essentially parables. They're New Testament parables that are set in Iowa, beginning in the 1930s, but then extending into the 1950s and up to the early 60s. And I'll just give you one more example. I also, from the Eastern side of it, I included Mother Maria Skoptsova, who, in addition to running those houses of hospitality, was not only a graphic artist, she was a painter and a weaver, but she also was a poet and a playwright and wrote many essays. And so I had no trouble finding lots of material, particularly material that talked about how the love of God and the love of neighbor cannot be separated from one another. I also wrote about Father Alexander Men, who was assassinated in 1990, and his attempt to kind of open the doors of the Russian church to the Russian society at that time and to the world beyond it, because Russia has always been a very closed in upon itself country. I included several others, but that gives you a little bit of a flavor for it. And it was an attempt to do something that I've done in other books too, which is to essentially, for my readers, to have them listen as I did, not so much to what I had to say, but to what these wonderful writers had to say, not only in their writings, but also in their lives. So in the case of all of these that I've mentioned, but particularly Mother Maria Skobtsova and Father Men and Merton, their lives too were a kind of putting the gospel into action.
Yeah, marvelous. Thank you for that, Fr Michael. And people might be wondering then, how can we practically, at a personal and or a communal level, come to a greater understanding of the world that is, one, perhaps sacramental, and two, ecumenical?
Well, I think that all of us now, no matter where we are living in extremely diverse settings. I mean, here's the sociologist talking to you. My teacher, Peter Berger, used to say that the increasing diversity worldwide, or the globalization, right, was perceived at first by people as something threatening. Let's say threatening to the idea of your own national identity, your own national language, your own national church, your own national culture. Well, you know, over the course of time and starting many, many years ago, I mean, in the case of the United States, it was already going on from 1880 to 1917 was the single biggest migration that ever took place anywhere, still is. But continuing on to our time, every part of the world has had an influx of people coming to earn a better living and have a better life, to flee persecution, all kinds of exiles and refugees and asylum seekers. It's clear in the Gospels, which I'm actually teaching a little course on now on Zoom, like everybody else, that while Jesus came and was first claimed by Israel, by his own people, his own faith, that the message of the kingdom of God, the good news, was for all people. I mean, at the end of Matthew's gospel, it's made very explicit. Go out into all the world, baptizing them, preaching the gospel, and lo, I am with you to the end of the age, okay? Mm-hmm. But even if you look at the adventures of the apostles, the Acts of the Apostles, it may start out in Jerusalem with the Pentecost, the Ascension and the Pentecost. But by the time you're done with the Acts of the Apostles, which we know is only a tiny sliver of the history of the earliest church, Paul is all over the Mediterranean basin, you know, and God knows where other of the disciples had gone by then, all over that territory of the then Roman Empire, but probably further than that too. And so immediately we see that the attempt to reduce the church or the Christian faith to simply one church body or simply one history of theology is mistaken. And it's not mistaken because I'm an ecumenist and because I'm a social scientist and I'm a modernist or an innovator. It's right there in our fundamental, if you will, our primary sources, right? I mean, if it's there in the New Testament, how much more basic can you have it, you know? So in practical terms, I mean, get up in the morning and leave your house. Now you have to be careful because of the pandemic, but you can't get past your block without running into brothers and sisters, not only of different Christian faiths, but of different world religious traditions. I don't care where you work, you're a teacher. I still am a teacher, on Zoom at least, but I taught for 45, almost 50 years. If you count every level I taught at, I taught people from every country in the world that you and I could name even if we were on Google. And in the part of the university, the City University of New York, where I taught for the last 40 years before I retired, we had 130 language groups represented just at our campus because it was a business school. So in some of my books, in Uncommon Prayer for sure, and also to some extent in some of the other books, Hidden Holiness and Saints as They Really Are, I have documented what it was like to teach, let's say, the New Testament to a class that had maybe 15 different religious backgrounds represented in the students in that room. Those were absolutely fascinating to hear their response to the parables, to hear the response of someone who had studied at yeshiva to how Jewish Jesus was. And you don't have to go very far. But I just would say in closing, because I'm sure you want to talk about other things, it doesn't mean, as some people jump to the conclusion, that somehow we're going to make one religion. And so
I want to ask you about that. So in that book, you help us to change our minds on what really constitutes prayer, and by making a claim that commonplace aspects of the Christian life are best understood as prayer, you can encourage us to see that everyday life includes religious import. How can we see prayer in the religious life that they're not restricted to special places and times alone, and indeed act this out, and all without diluting their significance, which I guess is probably going to be a counterpoint to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that was the result of my having done 3 books about obvious saints, not so obvious saints, and people who are never going to ever be officially recognized as saints. If I have a trilogy, that's what those books are. Those would be Living Icons, Hidden Holiness, and Saints as They Really Are. And in those 3 books, I probably, if you added them all up together, ask the readers to listen to meet first, see the faces of. I have a lot of pictures in my books, as you may know, and then listen to the writings and the lives of, I don't know, maybe a couple of dozen people, East and West. I mean, I started out with figures from the Eastern Church in Living Icons, because that was the church in which I was serving as a priest. But I had been a priest in the Western Church. I had been a friar in the Carmelites. I had been a presbyter in the Lutheran Church, right? So even me personally, I've had some kind of an official institutional status ecumenically. So I asked the readers to simply listen to these people, to these holy people. And in the end, what I thought to myself is, well, what's the central thing that we're supposed to be doing? St. Paul even says all the time, pray always. Well, you can't pray always if what you mean by prayer is, let's say, the divine office, which I say every day. I just do one version of it. Psalms and scriptural readings and intercessions and commemorating a holy person on that day on the calendar. What about the rest of life? Well, we know from so many authors, whether it's Brother Lawrence, you know, the famous Carmelite author, or St. Therese, the Little Flower, or Thomas Merton from our own time, from the 20th century, Dorothy Day, Mother Maria Skobtsova, that in fact, the work that we are given to do, the relationships that we form with our family and our friends, our co-workers, those that we serve if we are in positions to serve, like your students, my students, people in my parish where I helped out, neighbors on the same street or in the same building. All of these are opportunities to, as St. Benedict said in his rule, that when we see a visitor or we see a neighbor in front of us, that we are to welcome her or him as Christ. Not just because Christ told us to do this, not just because we love Christ, but to accept every person who comes into our lives as Christ. And I had somebody once say, you made that up. And I said, well, no, I didn't make it up. It's in St. Benedict's rule. But I said, it's also in the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers. If you have seen your brother or your sister, you have seen your God. I can't remember which Abba or Amma said that, but it's in there. In fact, I know the guy, Tim Vivian, he's an Episcopal priest who's doing a new translation of the sayings of the fathers and mothers that will come out in 2021. So that's what I tried to do in that book. I tried to get people to say, let's listen to some poets. So she was still alive at the time. I asked people to listen with me to Mary Oliver. She died recently, but she was a wonderful poet in the United States, a poet of great simplicity, but also of great perception. I asked them to listen to Mary Karr, Karr. She's published volumes of poetry and now 3 volumes of her memoirs, the last of which is called Lit, L-I-T, which is a play on the word for literature and a play on the word for being drunk, because it tells the story of her achieving sobriety and finding God. Also Christian Wyman, who teaches poetry at Yale, at the Divinity School, a very gifted poet who almost died from a very rare cancer and who chose to write a book chronicling his year of pain and uncertainty as to whether he'd live, having just been the parent with his wife of twin girls. It's a terrible time to die. He didn't. But then also others, who I said, let's listen to them. I went back to some of the old favorites because I think that they continue to be new for us. So Merton and Dorothy Day, right? And I believe Schmemann in there, and Alexander Men, and others. The whole point being, not that I went to each of these for a lesson in how to, in the morning or the evening, go to your corner or go to the local church, sit down and open a book and start reciting prayers. No, there's a place for that, and there's a place for liturgy, but there's also a place for finding prayer where the Spirit places us into prayer in just simply working, eating, sleeping, studying, reading, laughing, even I suppose at the pub. God is at the pub.
Lewis, Chesterton, all those ones would agree, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they overhear some of the college chaplains, say we're going to do pub theology. They gather at the pub. So that's what I was trying to do there. And it's one of my books that actually got a first prize in the Forward competition. It's small presses and university presses, and it got good reviews. Most of my books have always got good reviews, but because they're published by University Press, Notre Dame, they don't get as much, coverage. But religious publishing in general, at least in America, is really very difficult these days because people are not reading it. If anything, they're reading an e-version of it, or as you said before, going to a blog, going to a website or something like that. So that was the whole point of that. Not to make any kind of a new argument, but to simply say that as long as there have been people seeking God, they have sought God not only in the formal ways in the house of worship and in the scriptures of their faith, but also in what they do in everyday life and the people with whom they come in contact.
Marvelous. Thank you, Father Michael. So another person that you haven't mentioned yet, I don't think, that seems to have an influence on you and you've written about a few times and translated his work is Evdokimov, if I'm pronouncing that right. So he seems to be important for you. I was wondering what makes him so insightful and what can we learn from him? Because I've read a few books by him and I think he's fantastic as well.
Yeah. Well, he was in the second generation of the emigre writers and theologians in Paris. He served very briefly in the army during the Civil War. That was right around the time of the Russian Revolution. And then he and his mother and his sister escaped through, I guess, Crimea, and then Istanbul, and then eventually to Paris. And he very quickly got fluent in French, attended the Sorbonne for his undergraduate degree, and went right to the seminary, theological school that the American YMCA and the American Episcopal Church had funded there, the l'Institut Saint-Serge, the St. Sergius Institute of Theology. He was in their first graduating class in, I think, 1928. And he had as his teachers the very famous Russian philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev, and then also probably the greatest Eastern Church theologian of the modern era, Father Sergius Bulgakov. Not Mikhail Bulgakov, who wrote The Master and Margarita, but a relative, a distant relative of his, a very fascinating man. Challenging to read, but amazing. Anyway, two principal teachers of his, along with many of the other emigres who taught there. So he never got ordained, Paul Evdokimov. He was married. His wife was a teacher of Italian, professor of Italian. He had two children, a son and a daughter. And since he wasn't a priest, he didn't, get assigned to a parish. But he did teaching at Saint Serge. He was very active in the resistance during the war, hiding people. And then at the war's end began the work that he continued on almost to the end of his life, which was that he was, with his wife, the head of a house of hospitality for students from abroad, mostly from the then Third World, as it was called. Many of them from former French colonies. So lots of African students, but also from Vietnam and other places as well. They were the house parents. He became, if you will, the lay pastor, because they asked him to lead morning and evening prayer there. So given what went on in his life, most of what he wrote was an attempt to talk about the church in the world and how you lived out your faith. And he had good friends among some of the best theologians of that second generation. Like, he was very good friends with Father Nicholas Afanasieff, who was the only Orthodox theologian mentioned in the documents of Vatican II, and who, with Evdokimov, were invited as official ecumenical observers to the, I think it was the second or the third session of Vatican II. So they actually, it's clear to see, if you look at the two dogmatic constitutions on the church and on the church in the world, you can see some of their own thinking in those documents. Evdokimov was very good because he wrote about marriage. And he said, why should we think that somehow monastic life, religious life, is superior to it? These are simply two different vocations, two different ways of living out the gospel. So that was one of his interests. Another of his interests, he was very much affected by Afanasieff's kind of Afanasieff was one of the people who was involved with New Testament studies and canon law and church history. He made a big point about our forgetting the fact that in baptism, all Christians are made priests, prophets, and kings and queens of the kingdom. All right, so this is something the Catholic thinkers discovered, rediscovered before and during Vatican II. You could name here Yves Congar, you could name Henri de Lubac, you could mention later on Teilhard, several. And so he developed out of that this whole, what I would call a kind of a theology of vocation, or if you will, of being a Christian in the world. So that's one of the sources for the world as sacrament, just as much as Schmemann. That's also one of the sources for uncommon prayer, because in fact, he had these wonderful lines. He said, you know, it's not so much saying prayers, but it's actually becoming what you pray that prayer is all about. So that's why he was important. That's why I've written about him. I translated one whole anthology with a colleague of mine called The Church in the World of the Church. It's still in print. That's one of the reasons why I've written about him a lot, in addition to translating him and holding him up. Now, let me just say in passing, every thinker will have areas in which they kind of fall down. And one in which Evdokimov fell down and was intending to kind of correct this was the way that he treated women, dealt with women in his theology. He has a book that's still around called Woman and the Salvation of the World. And it is where he borrows from a number of French thinkers of the time, a kind of a typology of gender, which even in his lifetime, he came to see as way too restrictive and way too confining. And so he was actually going to do a total rewrite of this, but as happens sometimes, a heart attack took him in 1969. But his widow, I corresponded with her when I was writing, doing translations. I had to get some rights from her for some of his essays. She said he had planned to go back and revisit that book and essentially say, forget about the first version of this, I need to do a rewrite. Now that sometimes is not enough of I'm not trying to defend him, but that's not enough for some of my colleagues, women theologians, who say, he's very good on lots of other things, but he's not good when it comes to women in the church. But his very good friend, who I knew, and who was all of 5 feet tall, Elizabeth Bersigel, who was for many years the leading Orthodox theologian in France, a former Lutheran who had even served as a lay pastor before there was the ordination of women in the Lutheran Church. She kind of, how shall I say it? She compensated for his defects because she left us behind an amazing small literature about women in the church. And in fact, even toward the end of her life, really raised the question about ordination for those churches that had not yet decided to ordain women. And it was a challenge. It came out of her attending and participating in a number of World Council of Churches consultations, and then even work with Metropolitan Kallistos Ware, Timothy Ware, the very well-known, still living theologian in Oxford. And by the end of it, even Timothy Ware or Metropolitan Kallistos has said, there is nothing in the scriptures, there is nothing in theology, there is nothing in the liturgy that actually impedes the ordination of women. It's simply the path that some churches have taken. And that means, therefore, that there could be. He doesn't go as far as saying should be, but could be. So that's an area. I haven't ever written about that all that much, but I have served with women in ministry, and all I can say is they make excellent priests, as probably people over there know, and bishops too. Yeah.
Thank you, Father Michael. So, just want to ask you about that. Actually, do you think that there's more of a challenge within Roman Catholicism than regarding the ordination of women? Because it seems like John Paul II tried to say that was finalized, that couldn't happen or whatever. I don't really know much about that actually, but
yeah.
What?
Well, he said that, and it's unfortunate. It's one of several unfortunate things that he said. He
Yeah.
said a lot of very wonderful things, but I think in hindsight now, I mean, he's even been canonized. So therefore he's a saint and a sinner. Every saint is also a sinner. So, welcome to the human race. I think we can say that without insulting his memory or his legacy or his work. I think there is no way in which anybody in the church can say that a question is completely closed, especially a question like that. If it were a question about the Trinity, or if it was a question about Christology, who Christ is, maybe, because those are dogmas. And I agree with Father Bulgakov, who says, we're very careful about the tradition, but the tradition on the one hand is maximal and at the same time minimal. And there's the Holy Spirit's wisdom in that, right? So there's lots of ways of being church. We see it still today, from the Roman Church to all the other Catholic churches, some of which would almost seem not even to be Catholic because they're using Ge'ez Coptic, as the Coptic Orthodox Church does, or Ethiopian, and so on. In the Malabar churches, the Indian ones, and the Armenian ones, but they're somehow all there within the umbrella. It's a very big net. It's a very generous ark or ship, right? So I think when it comes to that, the issue is not closed. Papa Francesco has been very careful to say things, but then to sort of back away from them. I mean, I think he said some very important things about why Christians should be able to celebrate the Eucharist together, especially those that understand it the same way. And there really is no basis any longer for saying that Anglicans and Lutherans, and even some of the Reformed tradition, do not understand the Eucharist essentially the same way. They have different theologies, they've had different traditions of celebration, but still the bread and the cup are sharing in the body and the blood of Christ. Maybe they don't use transubstantiation, maybe they use different kinds of bread, but that's also the case in the Catholic churches, East and West. But when it comes to, I think, a question like ordination, that's a question of order in the church. And let's face it, we know that for the first millennium, the priesthood was not celibate. We know that for at least the first half of the first millennium, the episcopacy was not celibate. We know, I mean, all the great fathers who were bishops had wives, right? So those are questions of order in the church. And to say that somehow they're decided once and for all, and for everyone in the Church Catholic, it seems to me is not really legitimate. But I mean, there are plenty of Catholics who would agree with me. And of course, as you know, there are plenty of Catholics who would say, no, Rome has spoken, the cause is ended.
Thank you for that, Father Michael. It's very clarifying. So just back to one more figure from that book, if we may. What makes a saintly figure like Saint Seraphim of Sarov so engaging and especially powerful for our time?
Well, because in fact, I've written an essay, Seraphim of Sarov and Thomas of Gethsemane. I compared and contrasted Thomas Merton, who lived in our time, with Seraphim of Sarov, who lived from the late 1700s till the early 1830s. But I do know that there are essays, they're even in translation, comparing Seraphim of Sarov to Francis of Assisi. And so I think that in some ways is even better and clearer. Someone who refused, in fact, Evdokimov wrote a very interesting essay about this, in which he says, if you go through the life of Seraphim of Sarov, all right, he, like many in his time period, felt he had a vocation to monastic life. is received into the monastery as a postulant, then as a novice, right? Is then, tonsured, receives vows, becomes, is given a work to do there. I think he was from a family of construction people and carpenters, so he went right to work in the wood shop, made tables, chairs, etc., cabinets. But then they recognized the fact that he had really a pretty good basic education. So they made him a deacon, and then they made him a priest as a member of the community. But then he said, after a few years of that, I feel like I'm called to be a hermit. And he had a very generous and, I should say, spirit-led abbot who said, well, then you should have the chance to try that. And so for several years, he lived in a hermitage. They brought him food. He grew some of his own vegetables. At one point, robbers came in and beat the hell out of him and crippled him for the rest of his life. But the new abbot then said, enough of this. I don't want you out here. You have too many people coming to see you. You're becoming like a monastic celebrity. Well, because he was a teacher of prayer, because he had the gift of healing. Come back to the monastery. So back to the monastery, Seraphim goes, and then he becomes a recluse for a few years. He basically only comes out of his cell to receive communion at the Sunday liturgy, and the rest of the time he's in there reading, studying, praying. Until after a few years of that, he tells the brother who helps him out, open the door. And the brother said, what do you mean? The door of your room is open. It's open out into the corridor. He said, no. He said, go down and open up the main door of the monastery. You'll see why. And the brother did. And there's a line of a couple of hundred people out there, and they want to see Father Seraphim. So for the rest of his life, into the monastic cloister, these people come every day from, 8 in the morning after the morning services until 5 at night till Vespers started. Every day, people with physical ailments, psychosomatic ailments, psychological problems, and a lot of this is documented. There is now a translation of the chronicles that were written down after his death about all of the healing that he did, all of the spiritual counseling that he did. But, he was somebody who never stayed in one sort of category. And I think the suggestion of the Kiemoff makes is that he's trying to tell us something about the Christian life. Maybe you are called to be this for the rest of your life, but you may see a relative of yours, a friend of yours, who goes from one thing to another. Why could it not be that that's the Spirit leading them? So I think because of his love of nature, the fact that, like with Francis, the wolf came to Francis, told the wolf, stop destroying the sheep, and he fed the wolf. The local black bear came to Seraphim, and Seraphim fed him. And but also kids came to see him, and he loved playing hide and seek with them. And then he didn't care what church background, whether you went to church or not. He welcomed everybody who was troubled, everybody who was seeking God, to come and see him the last few years of his life. So in many ways, he was, I don't think he's a fool for Christ, quite, but I think he defied what the vocation of either a monk or a priest looked like. And I mean, let's face it, in our time, we've seen priests who were worker priests. We've seen priests who were involved in protests. We've seen priests who were involved in bringing food to the hungry. We've seen sisters do that. We've seen all kinds of Christians, people do that. It's not just for one category of person to do the works of mercy. So I think Seraphim of Sarov had a great popularity among people in Russia, but then as the emigration came, and he came along with it, and Western people heard about it. I know that in the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius that still exists, the oldest ecumenical association, Orthodox, Orthodox Anglican / Protestant / Catholic. They made him not one of their, he's sort of one of their patrons, along with St. Alban from Britain and St. Sergius of Radonezh, another monk from Russia. But Seraphim immediately evoked a connection with Francis of Assisi, and also his idea that you could pray doing almost anything. You could pray hoeing in your garden. You could pray making the dinner meal. You could pray listening to somebody who was troubled. So obviously you can see why he appears in several of the books there.
Yep, brilliant. Thank you, Father Michael. Let me just move on to another book that you have been involved in editing, then, The Church Has Left the Building. So the origin of the phrase "the church has left the building" seems to lie with Elvis. So
that's right.
Back in the day of his riotous fans after the concerts, it was announced that Elvis has left the building. So that expression seems to highlight the intense change within the church. How does the church change for its own existence and for the life of the world while maintaining its continuity with the great tradition?
Well, that book was me asking a bunch of people I knew, clergy as well as laity, and completely ecumenical background. So in there's Orthodox, Catholic, Methodist, Episcopal, Presbyterian, lay people and clergy, and myself. And I said to them, would you just write a few pages about faith, about the local church of the parish where you go and pray and the people that you pray with, and ministry, what you do to live out the gospel? Will you talk about that out loud? Let us listen to that. The readers will be listening to that, which was amazing. I mean, a friend of mine who actually, I was on her doctoral committee. She did the first ever study of Elizabeth Behr-Sigel. She's a Lutheran pastor, but also a very gifted theologian and writer. Sarah Henlicky Wilson wrote about the very first parish assignment that she was given, a group of very cranky, very turned in on themselves people in a small parish in Trenton, New Jersey, very close to where she was doing her doctorate at the Princeton Theological Seminary. And these people were so nasty. I mean, not personally to her, but so nasty to their neighbors that she writes in it, after getting ordained as a young pastor, my very first parish almost drove me out of the ministry and out of the church. But then she talks about what she learned there. And it's interesting because for me, this collection, the essay that I contributed to it was, as all of my books are, kind of the point of departure for the next book that hasn't come out yet, but will come out from me in 2021, called Community as Church and Church as Community. So let me talk about the two of them together for just a minute. The church has left the building means this, that we have had, or think we have had, the same model of the parish and the same model of the church beyond the parish, all the way from Jesus and the 12 apostles. Well, even if you only went to Sunday church school or catechism, you should know better than that, And I'm not judging anybody, but unfortunately, sometimes we reduce things to their almost absurd, simplest versions, So obviously, you don't have to walk very far from where you live to see parishes that are redundant. I mean, in England, that's what they've called them. Years ago, because of the spread of population, especially during the Industrial Revolution, because of the massive immigration of people, more and more and more parish churches were built. I know where I live back in the Hudson Valley in New York, back during the colonial times, because people could only go to a church that they could ride a horse or ride a cart or buggy to. There was a church in this little hamlet, this little village. And now one of my friends, who is the Methodist pastor of an association of these, there were 5 or 6 of them, I think, that were yoked together, because you get in your car and it's 5 minutes from this one to the next one, 10 minutes to the next one, maybe 15 minutes to the next one. In the end, you have 5 little struggling parishes, in some cases only a dozen people, 15 people. How is that going to continue on into the 21st century? Financially, it can't. It can't in terms of covering them with pastors. And also, too, one of the things that this declining, shrinking idea of who we are as a congregation turns into what one of my other friends, who's a Presbyterian pastor, David Frost, calls survival theology, and worse, survival strategy, where we keep worrying about every dollar and every way that we can save money. Turn off that light, turn the heat down a few more degrees. Maybe we don't send as much money into the national church this month or whatever. It becomes like, you know, the family that sees its finances going down the tubes, but can't come to terms with that, and still thinks that they can save themselves by cutting further and further and further. This is going on in many colleges and universities now, too. So these are some of the issues, very concrete issues, that these folks brought up, and the church has left the building. And so that what I did in the years since that, in the last like 3.5 years, especially since I've been retired, is that I keep talking to some of these clergy colleagues of mine who are in these attempts to either revive parishes or close them. And as I sort of look over a collection I was making of all kinds of efforts to either close parishes or revive them, reinvent them, replant them in their communities, it finally struck me that what I was seeing was, on the one hand, if you looked at it, the death of institutional religion, the death of the parish as we knew it. But in the Christian faith, what always goes with death? Not more death, but resurrection. I was saying before the internet dropped here in the desert, David Barnhart, a Methodist pastor in West Virginia, decided to go back a little bit into church history and see if there was some way in which the old system of house churches might make sense. Not just because people in his area were somewhat spread apart. In fact, they weren't. He could have easily developed a mission church, which he had done before. They called them white steeples. But he decided that people had had enough of that in a way, because it was the church that their parents grew up in and that they grew up in. And he kind of took he had read Afanasieff, I believe, and I think he had done work in early church history. He said, why don't we go back to basics? And why don't we try to have, smaller gatherings, smaller clusters, house churches, and see if, in fact, a network of them could become kind of a parish. Not unlike, as you have in this country as well as over there,